If you want to take home one slide from what I have to say, I highly recommend this slide, and I'd like to walk you through it. What's shown here as a function of time from 2005 on the left to mid-century on the right is the rate at which we're emitting carbon dioxide, gigatons, which is geek speak for billions of metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is a lot. You see, we're putting upwards of 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, again, mainly from burning coal and oil and natural gas, but secondarily from deforestation, cement manufacture, and another number of sources. And you can see that it's been going up in recent years. In fact, it's been going up continually for many years. There was a kind of one-year blip due to the Great Recession, but it's resumed going up again, driven now largely by rapid industrialization in developing countries with large populations, such as India and China, that are exploiting coal energetically. The three curves here represent three possible scenarios. This was from the Copenhagen diagnosis, which came out at the end of 2009. And so the dates here are chosen so that we could say, if you pick 2011 as the year when you would turn things around and mankind would stop raising its emissions every year and start reducing them, then this green line here is a scenario in which the emissions are reduced gradually so that by mid-century they haven't gone to zero. The blue curve is one in which emissions keep growing for another 4 years and then start being reduced and reach zero before mid-century. And the red curve is one in which emissions continue growing throughout the present decade and then decrease very rapidly, reaching zero by 2040. And what these three curves have in common is that the area under them is about the same. And it's the area under them that represents the total cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide during this period. And because carbon dioxide lasts in the atmosphere a long time, it's proportional to the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is what matters to the climate. Climate just reacts to how many of what kinds of heat-trapping gases are there. The more there are of an important gas like CO2, which is by far the most important man-made gas, the warmer it gets. So what these curves have in common is that the area under them represents the amount of CO2 such that you'd have a 2 out of 3 chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.6 Fahrenheit, above what it was in the 1800s. This is done in response to what some governments have decided. The European Union, for example, which is Western Europe, which has more people and a larger GDP than the United States, has formally decided as an official policy position that it will try to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 Fahrenheit in our units. Why? It's a judgment call. It's not a scientific decision. It's a little bit like your cholesterol, you know, that your doctor can't assure you that if your cholesterol is below a certain number, you can't have a heart attack. And if it's above that number, you're sure to have a heart attack. It's just that the risk goes up. And so this is a measure, you might say, of how much risk you're willing to accept. And it's also a measure of economic priorities and a number of other things. But the European Union, after careful consideration, has said 2 degrees Celsius is a target that they'd like to strive for. And a number of other countries have signed on to this informally as an aspirational goal. Some countries, especially low-lying island states, have said we'd like to have less than that much warming. But if you want to have that much warming, if you, the governments of the world, take that decision, then the science can help you say what it would take to get it. And what it says is there's a certain amount of CO2 that you can have in the atmosphere and no more. We don't know exactly, that's why this is a 2 out of 3 chance, but it says that if that's your goal, it's better to start reducing emissions right away, because then you can glide down with reductions of 3 or 4% per year. If you wait until 2015 before you reduce them, then to meet this goal, you have to decrease them by about 5% per year. And if you are going to procrastinate and dither, as the world has done, until 2020, then you must reduce them by this rate here, which economists will tell you is essentially difficult or impossible to do. I didn't draw this graph. It came from a number of German scientists, but I named it. I called it the ski slope diagram. This is the bunny slope here, and this is the intermediate ski slope, and this red line is the double black diamond expert slope. So that's where the urgency in my title comes from. It says this is not an issue like steel tariffs, you might say, or trade agreements that you can think about getting it done next decade if you can't get it done this decade. This is something that Mother Nature puts a time limit on. There's only so much CO2 you can tolerate in the atmosphere, and in this range, the climate change is just proportional to that amount of CO2. So that if you're serious about a target like 2 degrees warming, this is what you're faced with. You can't think about decreasing things in 50 or 100 years, you have to do it in 5 or 10 years. And that's the urgency. And it's in that sense that this urgency has nothing to do with politics or ideology, it's just science saying in a straightforward way that the physics and biogeochemistry of the climate system say that it's urgent to do that. It has to start happening in a few years. Alternatively, if you don't do anything, then you're not going to make that target. And you're going to have to cope with more climate change. It's been said that we're either going to mitigate climate change, that is, do this kind of thing to reduce it, or we're going to adapt to the changed climate, or we're going to suffer. And what we get to choose is how much of mitigating and adapting and suffering we get to do. So that's the take-home message of what I have to say. But not the last slide.